The only other thing, and I don't know if there's a downer for the show, like I don't know if you want me to talk about the fact that my college is closing.
Welcome to another D3 Datacast. Zach Snyder here, joined by my co-host Matt. And Matt, we have a special guest here. It's D3Hoops.com columnist Ryan Scott. How you doing, Ryan?
I'm doing well. I'm glad to be here. Really excited to get this season going.
Glad to have you back. I was going to say that I think this is your second appearance on D3 Datacast, and I know you were one of the original followers of the YouTube show D3 Datacast, and so having you on multiple times is great.
And I also have to thank you guys for the trading card of me is like the best picture that's ever been taken. So I've clipped that and used it as headshot for a number of different things now. So I also have to thank you guys for that.
So Ryan, one big reason we wanted to have you on this episode was, of course, we're getting ready for the season. Zach and I said last week we are now in season mode for D3 Datacast, but kind of a fun topic here. One thing that you have brought up a lot over the course of the last couple of years is, hey, wouldn't it be a fun idea if instead of just having conference tournament weekend and see who made the tournament field, what if we just had every team who wants to join the NCAA tournament and we bracket accordingly? And so that's what we're going to talk about today: is how would or would not the NCAA execute that? So a lot to look forward to. But first, as we dive into this season, how are you as a member of the D3Hoops.com family, and an alum and supporter of a Division III institution, getting ready for this upcoming Division III basketball season?
Yeah, so it's a bit of a mixed bag. We got a lot of the behind the scenes stuff for d3hoops.com is entering schedules, which takes hours and hours and hours at this time of year. So I get to see a lot of the schedules that teams are playing and kind of seeing who we're going to know about based on the teams they're playing. Um, but I try to hold off a little bit on thinking about which teams are going to be good and which players are there until we start getting the top 25 info, which should be coming pretty soon,
Yeah.
to start getting started there, because you never really know who's back and who's not. The rosters don't all get put up at the same time. Sometimes they change. Um, I do kind of end up putting the long list together for the preseason All American, so I do kind of have to watch a little
Okay.
bit who's there and who's not. But really, I try to hold off because it's so busy for so long. Once it gets started, I try to keep the off season as long as possible for me. And this year it's sort of a weird thing because I'm wearing the Eastern Nazarene College shirt here, but we will not be participating anymore. My alma mater is closing down, headed actually. So it's this weekend after as we're filming, but I assume this doesn't come out till Monday, right? So I will
Yeah.
have gone to the final homecoming, say goodbye to the campus and all that good stuff this weekend. So there's some bittersweet notes there, but looks like it should be a good celebration of the school and the history and all that good stuff too. So all of that wrapped up together, and probably once this weekend's done and our trip up to Boston, then I'll really lock in on what's going on.
Yeah, it's an unfortunate situation playing out at ENC, which is, part of a wider situation that's been playing out in higher education across the country, and unfortunately seems to be disproportionately affecting schools like a lot of the schools that participate in Division III athletics. ENC, I know, is certainly not alone in the current situation. They're not the first that's going to have to close, and unfortunately, it doesn't look like going to be the last. As it's going to be a situation that plays out over the next few years.
Yeah, it's rough. And I'll give a shout out to Brian Deshane, who was the captain of the NC basketball team my freshman year. He was the coach at Clark Summit. So he
Mm.
lost his alma mater and his job the
Wow.
same week this
Wow.
summer. That was a rough time. But I know there's a lot of people going through it, and he had to do it twice. So
Ryan, do you just like one more question maybe on the ENC side of things for you? Do you think, or has this impacted your Division III basketball fandom, not having your school participating this upcoming year? Do you see that as there's some aspect of Division III that you'll be following a little bit less, or the division overall?
Um, well, I mean, honestly, ENC has not been incredibly relevant at any of the last, I don't know, 10 or 15 years. And so selfishly, I won't feel as bad not getting to watch. I wasn't able to watch 25 ENC games because I had other games I needed to watch to make sure I was keeping up on the national stage. So there's part of me that's like, well, at least I won't feel bad about missing those things. But yeah, the opportunities and the tradition and the history, it's always been fun to keep contact with that. And I don't have a team to root for anymore. Although it makes me feel better to wear ENC stuff 2 games now that I won't be like promoting a school or anything. So
Yeah.
it is what it is, I suppose.
All right, so Ryan, jumping into the topic at hand here, where every team would have the opportunity to make the NCAA tournament, how would you envision that happening? Maybe what parameters would we have to put around it? What caveats would we have to say? Maybe cast your vision for how this might or might not work.
Well, obviously, the ideal scenario is somebody ponies up, 300% of our current budget, and we just fly everybody around where we want them to go, right? And we do it just like we do it now, but with a couple of extra rounds. Obviously, that's not going to happen. The NCAA is not going to put any extra money into this. They're not going to extend the season, so we would have to get rid of the conference tournaments probably. Which, as a caveat, I don't think the conferences want to do. Right? They enjoy having those conference tournaments and those championships and the chance to honor people. But let's say we're able to get that extra weekend by getting rid of the conference tournaments. We give everybody the opportunity to get in. We'll probably have to ask them to pay for that first weekend, which is another hurdle, and would probably mean some of the teams, especially the lower teams that don't have a chance of winning, will opt out of that. And so it would change. You'd have to have a deadline, I don't know, February 1st or something like that, so you could begin to know which teams are in and which ones you can start to bracket. But all of that being said, it's definitely possible to do. And I'm glad that you gave the opportunity this week for us to mess around with some brackets and give a chance to really prove. I've always thought that this was possible. But I think we've proven that it's at least theoretically possible, given the work that we were able to do this week with some mock bracketing.
Yeah, so what we kind of did behind the scenes is I kind of set up a spreadsheet, as I am wont to do. And we each kind of took a crack at how we would try to organize things around the country. We took a little bit of different approaches to it, each of us. So we'll talk about what our approach was, and maybe we'll show some examples of how the bracket came out, and maybe we'll talk about the pluses and minuses of each. And then maybe at the end we'll have like, will the NCAA actually do this discussion? And I think the spoiler answer is no, they will not. But getting through maybe just some of the examples that we made, let's start with just like a pure NPI bracket. So, Zach, we were able to kind of replicate what we think last year's NPI would have looked like for the entire Division III. So we said, like, what if we just took that, because we seed every team, and we just threw that into a bracket? This is Ryan's version of someone has ponied up the dollars. Like ESPN and Turner just go through a mega bidding war because they want to get the Division III Final Four on networks. And so now Division III is rolling in cash, and now we can pay for this. So just, we're not worrying about travel or money, pure seeding carrying the day. We're basing it on NPI. So I just kind of pulled maybe what last year would have looked like. And I'm just kind of showing the top portions of kind of two halves of the bracket here. So that's what it's looking like. So maybe the number one overall seed would have been Hampton-Sydney. We saw that by NPI. And they'd be waiting there in the round of 256, just chilling, waiting for the winner of Rose-Hulman and Howard Payne. We're going to maybe like fly them together midweek. I don't know what the logistics would be. Or maybe they both fly to Hampton-Sydney for like a Friday night game and Saturday gets the winner. We'd have to figure out how that would all work. And then maybe the most interesting one right below that is Baruch against Martin Luther. Like we want that on True TV for the NCAA tournament, probably on like a Thursday night. That would be great to see. So that would be like definitely mixing up the regions. On the other side of the bracket, Randolph-Macon waiting for the winner of Pitt-Greensburg versus Marywood. So these are the types of matchups that we are missing out on right now by not having a 412-team tournament. Guys, what would be the fun part about a pure NPI bracket?
Well, I think it's the matchups that you would never, ever, ever get under our current system. You can see it right there. Willamette and Penn State Altoona, which have got to be at least 2,000 miles apart. That those games would never happen. Now, obviously, like neither of those teams is going to make the tournament. At least they wouldn't have last year. So we're adding games that you would just never see anywhere else. But because it's Division III, like the seeding doesn't work quite the same way Division I, right? If you did this for Division I, you would still have basically the same 60 teams that have a chance to win this thing.
Mm-hmm.
D3, you never know where these upsets would be coming from. And somebody gets on a little bit of a run, you could have some team that you would never expect just running through this thing and ending up in the Sweet 16. And that would be exciting. That's really why I keep pushing the idea is that, you never know what happens in a D3 tournament. And this could be really amazing.
Yeah, another one I like on here would be E-Town in Sewanee going to Bethany Lutheran to whoever wins that going to Bethany Lutheran. I think that'd be a great game. And then the winner of that game, like Bethany Lutheran versus Clark, that would be a great round of 256 game right there, I think.
There's a couple of different ways to do this, right? Because you would have to get through in that first weekend 3 rounds. His opening round, the round of 256, and one more in order to kind of get us back on the schedule. So you may have like Stockton hosting 6 teams there, right? Stockton, Clark, and the games before that, all playing down to one person coming through. So, I mean that the logistics of it would be a little difficult, especially if you tried to do the opening round midweek and then having 2 rounds on the weekend, that kind of stuff.
And even if you project, let's say Clark and Bethany Lutheran ahead to meet in that next round, which would be a round earlier than we would get with a 64 team bracket, right? Like that's still a good Division III basketball game that I would like to see, right? So I mean, I think it shows that there's room to go beyond 64, and it's not like we'd be adding a bunch of matchups that wouldn't be interesting or we wouldn't like to see just as general Division III basketball fans, right? Like, and even if we're talking about a 64 team tournament that Clark and Bethany Lutheran are both in, and somehow, it works seating wise within that 64 for them to get matched up, they never would because of geography.
Yeah.
But here as a, what would it be? A round of 128 to see Clark and Bethany Lutheran matched up. I'm for it. Let's do it.
That would probably be one of your must-watch games of the second round, I think. Yeah.
Well, and even I was noticing making the bracket, which is something you wouldn't do unless you tried doing this, is that there isn't in the middle, maybe 200 teams. There's not a huge difference between the quality of those. And so even like you see on here, maybe a 33 versus a 96, is that Concordia Moorhead and York are. Maybe that's not a super close game, but most of these, Waynesburg and SUNY Canton, that's in anybody's game, even though the rankings and the seedings are pretty far apart. Most of these opening round games would be competitive.
Yeah, there would be some interesting games for sure. So here, I took a personal crack at it, knowing that we're not going to be able to pay for that. That's the first unfortunate thing. We're not going to be able to send Bethany Lutheran to play Sewanee or whoever that was. So what I tried to do is my method was, let's try to, as much as we can, truly seed the tournament like we did with pure NPI. Turns out that about the top 100 get a bye into that second round. But then everyone else, I tried to bracket around 500 miles. That's our current kind of flight rules. So this is in this unrealistic scenario of like a 412 team tournament. Let's try to save some money here. And what I found is it became a very regional tournament. You could probably mix up the East and Northeast actually still quite well with that many teams. There's enough in there. But as you get further west, then it becomes a lot more boring. The types of matchups you do see already in non-conference play ends up being played out. And especially if you're staying within 500 miles, you get to some degree like Region 10, like you get a bunch of Northwest Conference games and SCIAC games and then Texas games, and they all have to feed into one thing. I also kind of found I don't think it's really feasible for an NCAA committee to bracket this very well, to be 500 miles constrained and get like really good seeding matchups and make it interesting. I think there's so many variables. Maybe Ryan will disagree with me because he maybe did a better version, but I think it's really difficult to do this and do this well. So just one example I snipped from the bracket here, hopefully you can see on the screen, is just what my kind of Region 10-ish area would look like. It's Chapman and Whittier, 2 SCIAC teams. The winner goes to Pomona-Pitzer in round 2. Maybe you get Pacific and Pacific Lutheran, and they're going to play Cal Lutheran in the second round. Whitworth, Linfield, again, a matchup we see, Redlands, Caltech. So like maybe in the second round, you get some Northwest Conference and SCIAC matchups. But if you're trying to limit flights, you're even trying to limit that as much as possible. So to me, I found that there was kind of, a big negative that stuck out to me was it started looking more like the Division II tournament just larger, where every year it's going to be this is the path through, right? So maybe you mix up the ASC and the SCAC down in Texas, but that's really the only mixing that's going to happen. And otherwise, you're kind of playing almost a modified conference tournament, just in the way that teams are bucketed. So that was kind of my version and my takeaway. And now let's take a look at I think what Zach did.
Yeah, so I took a different approach, Matt. It seems like to expand it, you have to either get back to some sort of regionality. And to be honest, when I think about the topic of everyone making the tournament, to the extent that conference tournaments exist and that they're big enough to accommodate everyone who's actually in the conference. Now, a lot of them play 6-team or whatever team tournaments. So not actually everyone is even participating in conference tournaments anymore. But that kind of serves as a basis for feeding into a larger tournament, right? So I kind of took a middle out approach where we're starting with the familiar round of 64 and using the conference tournaments as the preliminary rounds before that. And so then the question is, how do you set that up? How do you, make it work? So I tried to mix a little bit of new theory along with kind of the landscape that we see right now. So we have round of 64 bids going to conferences, not teams. We already see that with the current Pool A, right? Every team is guaranteed one team into our current 64 tournament. But then let's use the regular season play to determine which conferences are granted additional spots in the round of 64, right? So this is the at-large approach, except instead of it going directly to a team, it's going to a conference. And since we're using the conference tournament to feed into that round of 64, like whatever that team that earned that conference's spot, they would be sort of the number one seed in that conference tournament sub bracket, right? But instead of it just being one tournament, it's like split apart so that it's feeding two different lines in the round of 64. We'll go through that a little bit more, right? So essentially what you're creating is a tournament where you've got, we'll call it like 64 seeded teams and everyone else is like unseeded. Now, I don't know a whole lot about professional tennis, but my understanding is if you look at a Grand Slam event, you've got seeded players and unseeded players. And so I'm going to go with that as my point of reference, even though I don't fully understand it. All right. So let's go to the next slide. Looking at a bracket quadrant, right? I talked about building the tournament from the round of 64 kind of middle out. So I didn't really go into like the 500-mile rule, but I just did like a really kind of hand wavy attempt here at what a quarter of the bracket, what one quadrant could look like based on the top 64 seeds according to how NPI would have played out this past year and bracketed it, right? So the number one team in the ODAC, which is sort of like the number one overall seed, Hampton-Sydney from a year ago, matching up with one team out of the AMCC, that being a one bid league. So you'd play the AMCC tournament, and whoever came out of that conference tournament, gets that line. Anyway, so at the blank bracket stage, you're looking at these little conference slots, and so if we go to the next slide, Matt, we can take a look. Let's talk about an expanded ODAC tournament where everyone's in the ODAC, and let's say the ODAC is a 4-bid league, right? So you could play the ODAC tournament, and since they've got 4 bids, hey, everyone who makes the ODAC semifinals, you're moving on to whether that's the ODAC 1 slot, the ODAC 2 slot, the ODAC 3 slot, however that looks on the round of 64. They would be the team that slotted through. And Ryan, you mentioned conferences probably wouldn't like giving up their conference tournament. So even though in this case, if the ODAC is a 4-bid league, you could just say, okay, qualify for the ODAC semifinals and you're on to the round of 64. You could still theoretically play that conference tournament out. You still have your champion. You can do your all tournament team. You can do whatever pomp and circumstance you want around the conference tournament. It's just that for the national tournament perspective, beyond that semifinal round, it's all fun and games. Now the problem with that is, if it's not 2 teams or 4 teams where you've got a clean, just take all the semifinals or whoever advances to the championship game, they're going on where they can play like an exhibition for the conference championship. So that gets a little bit messy if we're talking about like a 3-bid league, right? So I played around with it a little bit, taking a look. Next slide is what that might look like with the NESCAC if they're a 3-bid league. You kind of take the standings, create these like mini conference tournaments where you've got 3 going on to the round of 64. Right, Williams was the top seed in the NESCAC tournament, and so they've got a bye and a little bit of an easier path. Trinity, the 2 seed in that conference tournament, they've got to play Bates in an opening round game. And then actually the 3 seed was Conn College, even though Tufts was the 3rd team into the tournament this past year. So it's really interesting. I think what was the difference between, by the end of the year between Tufts and Conn College? Who knows? And this gives an additional path instead of having to make a 64 team bracket and say Tufts gets the spot, Conn College doesn't. Well, here they'd be on a collision course to play for that last NESCAC spot into the round of 64. So it's not perfect because, I don't know. You'd have to have a really wonky total bracket to be able to come out with something that identifies 3 teams to send on to the round of 64. But, maybe that is one of the necessary evils of going with this approach.
So Zach, in your method, if you had a large conference, I think the NAC was pretty large this last year, but they only qualified 1 team into the round of 64. You'd have to play that full conference tournament. So maybe that would be like 3 additional rounds before the round of 64. So if I'm thinking about it right, it might get pretty big for those leagues ahead of the round of 64. Am I saying that right?
There's for sure some logistical issues that are not fully baked, but we're not working with fully baked theories here.
You mean in half a week you didn't come up with a perfect solution to all of that? Cool.
Well, in that you actually hit my first idea when I first thought of this was to do something like this, to get an extra weekend so you could still play your conference tournaments. And then like if you had the same team that won the regular season and the tournament, you'd give them like a bye into the national tournament or something like that as a reward for doing that. But that was my original idea, was that you kind of play those down and get your champions and then kind of pool seed, anybody else who wanted to get in there and bracket around that. But so I mean, I think out of all these ideas, that's probably the most feasible, what Zach's come up with here.
Yeah.
To kind of give everybody a chance. At least that was my original thought, was so many of these conferences are limiting their conference tournaments, right? You only get 4 teams in or 6 teams in, that I wanted to give every team a chance, that if they happen to go on a crazy run, that they could still be alive, because some of them, they finish their season and they're just out. And that didn't quite seem fair to me. Certainly not in the D3 spirit.
So,
and
go ahead,
right
Zach.
now, this is the thing that always comes up in conversation, right? The conference tournaments are so ubiquitous now, except in the UAA for obvious logistical issues. But there's nothing that the NCAA says that the conferences have to have a conference tournament to award their Pool A, right? The NCAA says that every conference that meets whatever benchmarks and requirements will receive an automatic bid to the tournament. They leave it completely up to the conferences to determine how to award that. And so I think that maybe we could get to that end of the regular season point, and you just take that same approach and you say, okay, everyone knows they have their one, but you get to that end of the regular season and based on the final standings or NPI standings, you could say, all right, ODAC, you have 4 or 5 or 3 or whatever it is. And, MIAA, you have 2 or 3 or, however it turns out. And then it's up to the conferences to determine, what that bracket structure looks like. If they want to do something like I showed here, where, you don't really have necessarily a unified conference tournament that makes sense, and you have to kind of split it up to be able to determine which 3. I don't know exactly what that looks like, but it would be consistent with how things are set up now to say, okay, conferences, do with it what you want. It's just that instead of doing it with 1 bid, in some cases for another league, it may be 2 bids, 3 bids, whatever the case.
All right, Ryan, so you're sort of the originator of this idea. So walk us through your approach that you took to building out a bracket, and we'll talk through that as well.
Yeah, so I tried to be as realistic as possible. I actually ended up doing two brackets for different scenarios. The first one I worked on was just using the current rules, so the 500-mile rule to bring everyone together. And so I had what would be 8 team pods, more or less.
Yeah.
There were some buys in there, so it wasn't always 8 teams, but put that together so that they could all get centrally to a host in 500 miles. Um, the other thing I did was make sure that every regular season conference champion got a bye at least. And it actually worked out really well. There were only 5 because, as you said, that I think 99 teams ended up with buys. Or 100 or something like that, but there was only 5 that wouldn't have qualified in that top 100, and so it was relatively easy to put them in. The only issue is we still have problems with the islands, right? Texas and Southern California and the Northwest. And so what I had to do there was just kind of group pods together and almost create an extra, not almost, actually create an extra round. I don't know, you've got the clip out of the Skyak one. um, so you'd have Cal Lutheran as that round of 256, and instead of just having an opening round, we'd have to have some play-in games there for. We included Santa Cruz because they can drive down to the SoCal area in the 500-mile radius, and so that would be a real challenge, and it would also be unfair to them, right? That they
Yeah.
have to all play each other as they come through this. Um, One of the things I expected was a lot more like Zach's. I thought we would have to have sort of de facto conference tournaments all over the country, even to make this work in the 500-mile rule, just because of how many teams are in particular areas. But I was able to do a full bracket of teams without anyone from the same conference playing each other, except Northwest
Yeah.
and Skyak. Even the 2 Texas pods, I was able to split the SCAC and the ASC up enough that they didn't have to play someone from their own conference in the first round. And so that was kind of encouraging to know that that could be done. That would be expensive though, and so I did a second one where essentially I tried to match that first round with teams that were very close together, so they could do like a midweek game that wouldn't cost a whole lot, and then they would move on to a host for the round of 256 and the round of 128. Is that where we're at that point? Um, and that did have some more conference, not often though. I was surprised, more conferences playing together in the first round, but you're going to get that anyway in a conference
Yeah.
tournament, and so I wasn't too concerned about that. The one thing, as you said, is the regionality does pose a problem. We noticed when you put the NPI out that basically like the last 50 teams are all from the Northeast. And so when you start putting pods together, at Chicago or WashU or up in Wisconsin, you were not going to get really low ranked teams. Like there were going to be a lot of unfair matches, so to speak, um, just from the way that geography works. But it wasn't a terrible thing. Like I feel like it was really cool exercise to do because you could see logistically, like you can make it work without a whole lot of extra driving. In both cases, there were like 2 or 3 teams that ended up really with kind of a bad schedule in terms of going a long way. But for the most part, um, those look really good. I think you have another cutout from my. This is the downside of when you're really trying to keep teams close to home for that first round. You'll see you've got basically all Ohio schools, OAC and HCAC playing each other early on, and that was just so that we would keep costs down, keep travel down. But again, without conference tournaments, these are the sorts of
Yeah.
matchups that you kind of are excited to see anyway. And we were able to split it up, a good bit from different places. And I hope we'll be able to find a way to put some of these brackets up available on your website or something. So if people are really interested to come look and see what we put together, because it did take, I don't know, somewhere like 6 hours to put one of these brackets together in a way that made some sense. So it was not an easy process.
Yeah, we could definitely clip some interesting ones and share them on social media or something like that because I think it was a fun process to go through. But I thought about that too with some of the conference matchups. The fun of a national tournament is not having to have those matchups, but also on the other side, if theoretically we were replacing conference tournaments with some of these early round games, like those are matchups that were going to happen already. You were already going to get Albion versus Alma in a game, and so if you had to play them in a round of 256, like that's not the worst thing in the world necessarily. The other interesting thing you said was the regionality top to bottom, and I think that's often when we talk about strengths of regions or even just parts of the country, we talk about the teams at the top, and maybe one of the reason why some people might think hey, maybe the Midwest is stronger than the Northeast, even though the top teams are competitive. Maybe there's not that total gulf at the bottom of just there's maybe some weaker conferences as a whole, or just weaker teams in the Northeast, or at least the availability of those teams within 500 miles. So if you're trying to pick teams to go to UW Platteville, the first round game's pretty easy for them, but once you get to the second and third round, they might be playing a game that they're going to have to prepare for. At the very least, you might be able to get Williams to play 1, 2, maybe 3 rounds of games that are going to be fairly easy matchups for them. So that is an interesting difference in regionality and just the ability to mix up teams. You have such a population and density of schools on the East Coast that allows you to mix up those, give those higher ranked teams kind of more true seeding than maybe you will in other parts of the country.
Well, and I'm wondering, you guys will know better as we go through this new NPI system. I'm wondering if just because in the Midwest there are a lot fewer weaker conferences, that those NPIs just end up higher, because even if you're in a weaker conference, your non-conference games are going to be against stronger schools in general than, when you've got a real, a large number of maybe lower conferences in the Northeast that can kind of play each other and maybe holds the NPIs down a little bit up there. It was just really kind of shocking, because the way you set this up, once you get your buys in and everything, you start looking for like, what's one of the highest ranked teams and what's one of the lowest ranked teams that are somewhere near each other that we can start to match up. And you get like, this is a good example, Hanover, they should probably be playing a team that's maybe 30 or 40 slots lower than Earlham, but there aren't teams in Ohio or Michigan that are in those rankings. And so that's really interesting. And then you kind of forget, if you don't live in the Midwest, how far, like Concordia Moorhead is way up there in Minnesota, and they can't get anywhere within 500 miles. So they sort of have to play in Minnesota. That kind of thing just doesn't happen on the East Coast. Even some of the Western New England teams can get to Virginia.
Yeah.
And so you can cross regions that way much easier than you can really do as you get out west. If Nebraska Wesleyan is hosting something, it's even the Arkansas schools have a hard time getting up to Lincoln for that kind of stuff. So that comes into play as well.
Yeah, not quite the problem the Region 10 islands have, but you get to the western edge there, and your 500-mile radius doesn't mean anything to the west. So you only have really one direction to start looking for your 500 miles, whereas when you're more centrally located, that 500 miles is more like 1,000 miles, right? Because you go 500 miles one way or 500 miles the other way. And not to mention just the density overall of the schools, more on the eastern side than the western side.
Yeah, filling up my mock bracket here, I filled up the host sites in Michigan and Ohio with teams farther west entirely. And so I had to send most of the Ohio schools into Pennsylvania and Virginia and places like that just in order to make the geography work. And that's true even of a 64 team tournament that they're trying to seed regularly in a regular season.
Absolutely. We've seen that, Calvin makes a tournament and they've always been much more likely to head west than like into Ohio. It seems like, just because you've got to have teams that you pull towards hosts that way. Whereas, if it's Western Pennsylvania, Eastern Ohio, there's a lot of teams to draw from.
All right, so kind of winding down this topic, guys, I don't know if you have any big like takeaways of like, this would be a really, really big plus of the system, or this would be like a really big minus of the system. Ryan, I don't know if I'll go to you. What turned out to be something you really liked, and then maybe you really did not like about going through the process yourself?
One is there's just going to be a lot more unfairness just inherent in the system once you kind of get the geography worked out. There's going to be one, and at some point you say, when do we care, right? There's going to be one 52 seed who's got a much tougher opening round game than another 52 seed, right? Like, just because of the way geography works out. I don't know how much we care about that. Obviously those coaches and teams are going to care about that if we went to something like this. And obviously the politics of it is what's going to keep this from happening. But I do think it would be an interesting niche for D3, right? For, if you're publicizing to the wider audience, right, here is a 412 team bracket, right, that you can fill out your bracket. You can follow these games online for free, for the most part, fingers crossed still, that I think you could get a wider audience to tune into this sort of thing. I don't know how you'd monetize that or pay for the whole thing, but like I do think it's a viable option, even if it's not a practical one or one that's likely to happen. Going through this process really made me think like this could happen if some miracle got 412 schools on the same page to vote for something like this. Like it would be possible, even if it's not super feasible.
And think about all the programs that would suddenly have the ability to say, we've won an NCAA tournament game, that in the current state of things are like would never even have a chance really to get into the tournament. Aside from everyone having access to the pool A, some of those games end up lopsided against the Hampton Sydneys of the world or something like
Right.
that. So
We're 4-26 this year, but one of them was an NCAA tournament game that we
boom,
won.
there
So
you go. Perfect. Yeah, Matt, one of the things that really struck me as I was working through my approach, which admittedly was a little bit different, but I was trying to be purposely a little bit different, is it felt like in a lot of ways I was kind of creating solutions to problems that don't exist, or solving the problem in ways that were really unsatisfying, right? Like we went through that. Like if you're talking about a 3-bid league, there's maybe not a real clean way to completely keep the conference tournament intact. Which may or may not be a problem depending on your point of view. But it's like, to make it work, it was not quite as satisfying as I was hoping. And then, starting with a middle out approach where you're setting up a bracket based on who would be projected to be there, really sets up for there to be chaos, right? And maybe that's fun, but the chaos is that we enjoy at March Madness time is more based on a good bracket setup versus what happens before it and then feeds into the round of 64.
I think, talking about that conference tournament and March Madness chaos, I think one thing I've sort of lamented over the last several years is it feels like conference tournaments have shrunk. Part of that is cost, part of that is competitiveness, part of that is like in the old SOS system, a 1-versus-8 game in most conferences was detrimental to Pool C chances if that number 1 seed lost. So just trying to protect your additional bids that we've been talking about for your conference, some of that has led to shrinking conference tournaments. I really like the idea that Ryan said earlier on. If any team gets crazy hot, they can get into the NCAA tournament. So I'm more in favor of the MIAA going back to that full 18 tournament, and you always get that Tuesday or Wednesday game. It's 1-versus-8, and you have to play the game. And even though the one wins it every single year, I think there's something interesting about that. Or at least it gives the chance, or the thought of a chance of that 8 seed could go on a run and get into the NCAA tournament. So from that standpoint, I like how this kind of maybe incorporates that idea of any team can go on and win the championship. I really like that you could make a system like this that rewards regular season champions into the tournament as well. Sometimes that accomplishment of winning a regular season championship, which is a great thing, gets diminished because we get so focused on who's going to make the tournament, getting that pool A, that it turns into who's going to win the conference tournament. But with a larger expansion, you could maybe reward both of those things and have different ways to do that, so that the regular season championship, which in a lot of ways, winning your regular season conference championship, I think is goal one for a lot of teams. Like that would be the thing you love to do. Everything else, there's a lot of randomness, but this is a thing that you can work towards and try to grow. So I really like that aspect of this type of scenario. One thing I think that is tough, we've talked about it a lot, is the regionality can get concerning at times. And I think the regionality is worse in areas that it's already bad now, right? So think about Southern California and Pacific Northwest. We already hear from Region 10 fans and coaches every year about how if we get into the tournament, we're probably the exception of there's another team from our conference maybe in our pod, and we have to play them in the second round already. We maybe get hosed out of a hosting bid because of geography, and you can't fly teams in here, so you have to fly teams out. So those are already the parts of the country that are already getting a little bit screwed in the process, or at least feel like they are, and they would be very vanilla through this new system. It would pretty much be the NWC tournament and the SCIAC tournament with a very small amount of cross-pollination early, and then at the round of 64 or so, we can meet on with the rest of the country. That's just the reality of the situation unless Uncle Moneybags comes along and funds the thing. So that would be a challenge, and that would be, something that's not as fun about this, but would probably be a reality of the situation.
And that's also where using the conference tournaments to feed in, yeah, that would be not much of a change maybe to how it feels for those island schools, but it would force the rest of the country into that situation, which feels like an overall step back. I mean, I think we want to be looking for situations where we can mix that up for Region 10 into the rest of the picture, and not sending the rest of the country backwards.
Yeah, and there really isn't a way around that, right?
Right.
Without being willing to fly, 12 or 15 teams around to make this happen over the course of a tournament, that the money is just not currently there for. One of the things that has been pushed and probably will still not happen because of money is just how many more teams Division 3 has than Division 1, that we should have more than 64 teams in our tournament, right? To keep the same access ratio. And one of the things that, I mean, is possible going forward, I was thinking if you give an automatic bid to the regular season champs and the tournament champs of every conference, and you keep, relatively the same number of pool C bids, yeah, maybe sometimes that's the same team and you give them a special buy or something like that as part of the tournament. But you could easily go to 96 without really watering down the product that we have. And it would be sort of somewhere between what we're doing now and this experiment that we had this week, right? To put some games together where you're getting, a couple of at least potential bids in. Maybe that doesn't solve the problem out west, but it might, if there's 7 or 8 island teams, it might be more feasible to fly them around to the right places or to give them a hosting opportunity, which might be the best of both worlds. It give us a better access ratio, but again, that comes down to cost. And right now, especially with who knows what the future of the NCAA looks like, I don't think they're spending lots of extra money at the moment.
Yeah. And I did think coming out of this, we've seen Division 1 grow their tournament, and they have more of these play-in games, first four types of games. I think there was some sort of discussion, like you were alluding to, Ryan, of what if the NCAA did expand based on numbers. Now, I think we've seen that hard fixed again and again at 64. But to what degree would those selections and seedings work out, and how would that change the regionality? One thing I was thinking is 64, given the geography and constraints of Division 3, pretty close to the sweet spot where we can mix up a lot of the country. There's a few spots in the country where we can't really mix it up year in and year out. If we expanded it too much more, it wouldn't really add to the experience of getting to play teams from other parts of the country, and any less would feel too small. So maybe we do have a pretty good sweet spot somewhere around 64, but it would be an interesting exercise to go through, like you said, Ryan, get 20 more spots or something like that, more than we have now, and how would those allocate around the country, and how would that feed into the tournament?
And they've done, at least gotten, it seems, tacit permission to not just throw the islands together the second weekend too, right? Like it used to be, you'd have one Northwest team and one, California team and 2 Texas teams, and they'd all end up in one pod, right? So you'd only have one team to fly the next weekend. It seems like they've got a little leeway to not automatically do that every single time out, which is good going forward. And that's the best that you're going to get. I mean, there's just not really a way around it unless you're going to throw all the rules out the window and just seed it, straight on rankings, which, seems like Division 1 basketball is the only place that happens. So the other less revenue sports in D1 don't get that same treatment, right? Like baseball is still pretty regional.
Yeah.
Because they can't afford to travel the same way that they can for the basketball tournaments that are making all the money.
And so this is my conclusion here is, if there was additional money, let's not spend it on and everyone makes the tournament, but let's enhance the 64 team tournament we have right now, right? Because I think we've seen in recent years, there can be some interesting things if right now we have to kind of hope for the right situation where they can't conveniently make like a Southern California pod or something like that, right? Like 2 years ago, we saw a situation where Whitworth was flown out, and I think they played a first round game against St. John Fisher. And if memory serves, Pomona Pitzer flew out and they played Williams, right? So I wish that we could not have to rely on the numbers just lining up perfect and based on who gets in and whatever, and that we could just have that kind of situation all the time. Like let's get an expanded pool of money, yes, but let's not spend it on a 412 team tournament. Let's make this 64 team tournament a lot better, where we can handle those Region 10 teams more fairly, get more interesting games, frankly.
And make it so Williams has to fly to Pomona Pitzer every now and then, right?
Sure. But then to that same point, it would be great to see conferences go back to expanded conference tournaments where we still have that element where an 8 seed could theoretically get hot and play their way into the 64 team tournament. So the conference tournaments wouldn't be, in fact, a direct path into into the round of 64 based on it being a fully national tournament, but there still exists that possibility that within the current conference tournament structure, they could get there. But if a conference is only doing a 16 tournament, you finish 7th or 8th, oh well.
I do think we should push as part of the D3 ethos that at least everybody gets into a conference tournament, right? You should give everybody a chance to get through. I remember, speaking of ENC, I was not on the team, but I was at every game. My junior year, we made the conference championship and lost a heartbreaker and brought everyone back and high hopes for senior year, and just didn't work out that way. But did manage to snag the 8 seed and did manage to knock off the number 1 team in that first game. That's the only win they got, but like that is one of my strongest memories of going to games. Was an intense, down to the wire sort of thing. And obviously it wasn't for anything, but it meant a lot as a way to end the season. And I think there are plenty of teams out there who have no aspirations on a national tournament, let alone national championship, that deserve those opportunities in do or die time.
If everyone can at least play a conference tournament game, then we have a de facto everyone has access to the tournament, if not a full-on everyone makes the tournament.
That's great. And I think, for a lot of student athletes, I think that is a good experience, right? At least participating in a chance to make the tournament. And I think, an exercise like everyone makes the tournament, I think ultimately comes down to giving those teams, those players, a chance to compete on the national stage on some level. And I think you're right, Zach, giving them that access through a conference tournament would be a good place to start too. All right, well, I think that's a good place to wrap up for today. It was a fun discussion. I think we can all agree probably not something likely to happen in the next year or two, but we'll see beyond that. Ryan, thank you for joining us. Always glad to have you as a friend of the show and occasional guest here, so appreciate having you on.
Matt, it was a lot of fun talking with Ryan, trying to look at what it might look like, feel like, how it might work if every team made the NCAA tournament. And we get to have fun like that because we have great support from people through Patreon at patreon.com/D3Datacast. And we're so grateful for their ongoing support. And thanks to them, we can do things like this show. We can do things like post efficiency ratings and NPI numbers coming up for the season without any ads or paywalls on D3Datacast.com. And special shout out to Coach Jay, who joined us at the Great Job Team tier this past week.
Thank you so much to Coach Jay. Thank you, Ryan, for joining us this episode. Zach, thank you for joining me as always. And for now, we'll say, great job, team.
Good job, team.